Hi, my name is Camille Reinecke and I am a baker located in Scranton, Pennsylvania. Thank you so much to the Everhart Museum for asking me to be a part of this video series. In today's video, I'm going to be showing you some of my favorite techniques for decorating a cake within a floral and botanical theme. I hope that you enjoy and that you feel inspired to decorate a botanical cake of your own. Alright, so the first step is going to be to frost my cake. So as you can see, I've already assembled my cake. This is 3 layers of chocolate cake and I have a nice crumb coat of vanilla frosting. And now I'm going to add my final coat of frosting. I've decided to do sort of a vibrant peachy pink color because I want this cake to be really springy. Alright, now that I've completely frosted the cake, I'm going to put it in the refrigerator to set for at least 15 minutes while I work on some other elements for the cake. The first element that we're going to work on for our floral cake are fondant flowers. So I've made a few different types of flowers, peonies, daffodils, poppies, and roses. So today we're going to be making pink roses for our cake. So in order to make your fondant roses, you will need fondant. You can make homemade fondant using marshmallows, but I use fondant so infrequently that I typically just like to buy the store-bought fondant, which works really well for the flowers. So that's what I'll be using today. You'll also need a teaspoon and something to cut your pieces of fondant with. I like to use a non-stick mat on my surface so that the fondant doesn't stick to your countertop, and also a piece of parchment paper, which actually I'm going to fold in half. So when you're making fondant roses, you are basically making individual petals that you will assemble into a rose formation. So it's really important, in order for your rose to look realistic, that your petals have a little bit of dimension, and you don't want them all to be the same color. So since we're making a pink rose, we're going to start by softening our fondant and then making sort of a gradient of pink tones and pink shades for our rose petals. So in order to achieve this gradient of color, we're going to have 3 different shades of pink. So we have our darkest, medium, and light. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use food coloring. I like to use Americolor gel food coloring. I think it works really well, nice, beautiful colors, and I think the gel works a lot better than liquid food coloring. So I'm going to use Americolor's shade Deep Pink, but I'm only going to be using a little bit of it, so it's still going to give me that nice light pink color. So I'm going to use a toothpick to make sure that I'm not just globbing on too much. So I'm going to put a decent amount on my smallest section here because I want that to be pretty dark, and then a little bit less on the medium section, and then very little amount on our biggest section because we want that color to stay pretty light. So now I'm just going to carefully mix that in. Alright, so what we're going to be doing is cutting small sections of each color. So from our darkest shade, I'm going to cut 2 sections. So just small sections. From my medium shade, I'm going to cut 3 sections. And for my lightest shade, I'm going to cut 4 sections. So the next step is going to be to take each of these sections and roll them into small balls. So just using the palm of your hands, roll them up into small spheres. I'm going to be spreading them out inside of the folded parchment paper. You only want to use one side so that you can close them in. So you want to make sure that they're not going to spread into each other. So make sure they each have enough space. All right, now we're going to close them in. I'm actually going to turn them this way. So if you want to give a little push, just to make sure they're all stuck in place. Now we're going to take a rolling pin. What we're going to be doing is you're going to be spreading them out, and you really want to be pushing mainly in one direction so that they are longer than they are wide. They will widen a little bit, but you really want them to be long oval shapes. So now that they're rolled out, you can see that they are flattened into sort of oval shapes. Now we're going to be closing them back into the folded parchment paper, and you're going to use a teaspoon. So I like to use the back end of a teaspoon. So I sort of put my finger in the teaspoon and use this rounded back part. And what you're doing is you're smoothing around the entire perimeter of each petal so that they're really thin on the edges, giving them a nice realistic look. So I'm just going to start on this side, just work my way around the petal using the back and applying some pressure on top of the parchment paper to smooth each petal. Alright, so now each petal is nice and smooth around the edges. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my bench scraper and just cut each petal in half widthwise. Alright, so now that all of my petals are cut in half, I've sort of arranged them by color. So I'm going to be starting with my darkest color. So if you want to pick up 2 of your darkest petals, we're going to be sort of pinching, overlapping the corners of the petal, giving it a little pinch so they sort of stick together, and then just rolling those petals together. So we're just rolling them around each other like this. This will be the center of our rose. Now you're going to take your next petal, connect it to the very edge of the last petal, and roll it around. And then instead of tucking this edge of the petal in, you're going to use that to connect another petal and continue to roll around. All right, now we're going to move on to our medium petals. So I'm going to start by placing one where there's sort of a gap in between petals. And then instead of tucking in this edge, I'm going to use it to connect another medium shade petal. Roll it around until I get to the edge of that petal and add another petal in. All right, so now I'm going to start with my lightest petal. So I'm just going to start by placing one and then connecting another petal to the edge, rolling it around. So now once you have all of your petals rolled, you sort of want to squeeze the bottom of your rose so that all the petals stick together with the warmth of your hands and the pressure that you're applying. That fondant will just stick right to itself. Now I'm going to go in and I'm just going to use my fingers to give each of the petals a little bit of texture. We don't want them to be perfect, like sticking straight up. So I'm just going to go and give some folds and creases, open up some of these inner petals and bend them down. You just want to give a lot of texture to your flower here. All right, and there's my first fondant rose. If there's any excess on the bottom of your rose that you want to trim off, I usually like to just slide it right over the edge of a bench scraper to sort of take off that little bit so that there's a nice flat surface. And now I'm just going to stick this to the side so it can dry some while I work on another rose.
All right, so now looking at our fondant roses from a different angle, we're going to start by cutting our light, medium, and dark fondant into small pieces and rolling them into nice round shapes. So now we're just going to be arranging our fondant pieces within the fold of our parchment paper, making sure that they each have enough space so they won't be squished into each other when we roll them out. Now we're using a rolling pin on top of the parchment paper to roll out our fondant pieces. And once our petals are rolled out, we're going to use the back end of a teaspoon to smooth out the edges of each of our petals. Once the edges of your petals have been smoothed, the next step is to cut your petals in half widthwise. Then you'll start assembling the rose by taking two of your darkest petals and rolling them around each other to form a nice spiral. Then you'll continue to add your darker petals, followed by your medium shade petals and your lightest petals. It's important to make sure you're pinching around the base of the rose at this point so that all of your petals stick together. The final step will be to go around and add texture to your petals so that it looks nice and realistic.
All right, so the next step in decorating my cake is going to be actually using buttercream frosting to paint floral designs directly onto the cake. So I started by mixing some different colors of buttercream. The first color that I mixed is this deep forest green, which I was using a fern sort of as the inspiration for that color. And I'm actually going to be using palette knives to paint fern designs on my cake. And then I also painted, or mixed two different shades of pink that sort of match the colors used in my fondant roses, just to sort of tie it all together. So the first thing I'm going to do is envision where I want the ferns to take up space on my cake. I like when a fern design may start on the side of the cake, but then may branch all the way up to the top of the cake. So I'm just going to sort of map out where I want my first fern to go, and then I will start using my palette knife to paint it on. So I used my palette knife to sort of score where I want the fern to go, and now I'm going to start painting it. So in order to do that, I just sort of work the buttercream, get some on the back of the palette knife, scrape the edge so it's a nice neat amount, and it's really only on the back end of the palette knife.
So as I begin painting the fern on my cake, I start with a pointy leaf that will be the top of the fern. Then I continue to add increasingly larger leaves down the length of the fern. One thing that I really enjoy about painting ferns and flowers on cakes is that they're organic shapes. So it's okay for them to be asymmetrical, it's okay for them to be imperfect, even if they are whimsical and those organic shapes, they'll still be very interesting to look at, very beautiful, and very convincing. So now as I begin to paint my fern down the side of my cake, I continue to follow the mark that I made as my guide. So I know that the fern is swooping down to the right, so I will continue to add leaves in that shape. The next step is going to be to use a piping bag with a small round tip to pipe a stem in between the two columns of leaves. Then I'll be using a palette knife to smooth that stem out and sort of blend it into the leaves. So now I'm using a small palette knife with my light pink frosting to start forming a flower on my cake. So I'm taking large amounts of frosting and smearing them into round petal shapes. They're not uniform, they are organic shapes. It's okay if some of them are three-dimensional. You want some of the flowers to be lifted off of the cake like that. And I'm just going to continue using this palette knife to spread my light pink frosting until I'm happy with how it looks. Once I'm happy with the formation of my light pink petals, I'm going to go in with a slightly darker shade of pink and a smaller palette knife to form a smaller ring of petals along the center of my flower. Once again, it's okay that these are an organic shape that isn't uniform. You want to have lots of relief and three-dimensional aspects to your flower, so it's okay to use a lot of frosting here. And it's really just fun to keep working with it until you're happy with how the flower looks. So now I'm going in with a leaf piping tip and adding some leaves around my palette knife flowers. You can definitely use a palette knife to add leaves to your flowers, but sometimes I like using a piping tip just to add another element to the cake. Alright, now that I have painted my flowers and added some leaves, I'm going to go in with some yellow and add stamens to the center of my flowers. So I just have a small round tip. As you're piping the center of your flowers, you want to apply pressure and then release pressure as you're lifting away from the flower so you get a nice pointy stamen in the center of your flower. Alright, so I've added the fondant roses to the top of my cake, and here's my finished product, a very springy cake. Thank you so much for watching my video. I hope that you learned a lot about decorating floral cakes. I hope that I've inspired you to try decorating a floral cake of your own. Please follow me on Instagram at bakewithcamille. I would love to see what you're up to, and I would love to answer any questions that you have about this cake or similar designs. Thank you so much for watching my video, and thank you to the Everhart Museum for asking me to be a part of this series.